The US national debt just eclipsed a whopping $30 trillion. It's really a mind-boggling number, and in this video I want to go over the growth of the national debt, especially over the last few decades, and also get into potential solutions for the debt since this doesn't really look like it's going to be ending well. Before I get too doomsday-ish, let's talk about the growth of the national debt. The US national debt did not get all the way up to $30 trillion overnight. It's taken many decades and has really accelerated in the past couple of decades to get to this point. And it's not as though it's been under one particular president's watch or under one particular party's watch. Really, this has been a team effort. And if you look at the past few presidents, that's where a lot of the national debt growth has really come from. We can start with President Bush, who actually doubled the net worth under his tenure. In his 8 years in office, the national debt grew by $6.1 trillion, which is about $763 billion per year. Immediately after this, President Obama, during his 8 years in office, added $8.3 trillion to the national debt. That comes out to just over $1 trillion per year. But not to be outdone, President Trump, in his 4 years in office, added $6.8 trillion to the national debt. That's an average of $1.7 trillion per year. But it looks like we might just be getting warmed up because President Biden, in his first year in office, added $1.9 trillion to the national debt, which, if we do some complicated math, that is $1.9 trillion divided by 1 year, or $1.9 trillion per year added to the debt. We'll see if he keeps this rate up or if it accelerates at all. And that's one of the things about the national debt, in that as more interest costs are accrued, that's getting added onto the balance if it's not paid off in full during that year. But how big is $30 trillion really? It's a pretty difficult number to conceptualize. Well, one way to measure the weight of the debt on the economy is to compare that debt amount to the GDP. GDP stands for gross domestic product, which is basically the total amount of goods and services that an economy produces in a given year. It's all of the stuff that the economy makes. And a common metric to use is the debt to GDP ratio. Well, total federal public debt to GDP got as low as 30% back in 1981. It actually eclipsed 100% for the first time in 2012. And now, as we enter 2022, the total debt to GDP ratio is up over 120%. And yes, that means that the debt amount is currently larger than the total amount of stuff created by the entire economy in a given year. Or in layman's terms, it's really big.
Look at the size of that thing.
Okay, so the debt's really big and it's continuing to grow. What do you do to actually solve the debt problem? Eventually, this debt's going to have to be paid back at some point. So how do you do that? One of the quote-unquote obvious solutions to the debt problem is to simply raise taxes at the same time without raising spending, so that the government can actually run a surplus and then use that surplus to pay down the debt. But this strategy of austerity, where you raise taxes at the same time that you don't raise spending or even lower spending, this strategy is not very popular and it's not politically feasible in many cases, but it also might be counterproductive in many ways, because when the government raises taxes, it's effectively taking money out of the private economy. And when the money is taken out of the private economy, it's not going to grow as quickly. So you might actually hurt your actual net tax receipts because there's simply less activity in the economy. In other words, you might be boosting tax revenue in the short term at the same time that you're hurting growth for the long term. And you can say a similar thing about cutting government spending, because when you remove that spending, that's money that's effectively being taken out of the economy, especially if it's being paid for with new money, with debt. That money's being injected into the economy and it's used for whatever. Well, if you remove that, then all of a sudden, the people who might be relying on that spending no longer have it. And you could get a similar sort of thing where you're hurting growth. There are plenty of arguments to say that government spending is not efficient, so maybe that's still a good thing long term because you're getting the government out of the way, but that's kind of an argument for another time. All I'm saying is that austerity as a strategy is not always as simple as it's made out to be, and it's definitely not very politically palatable when you're going to be taking away government benefits from people at the same time that you raise their taxes. But if something's not done to address a debt problem quickly enough, you might get into a situation where you have a sort of runaway interest problem. This is where just the interest payments on the debt eventually outweigh all of the federal tax revenue, so that there's no way to actually pay down the debt without doing something drastic. Right now, net interest costs are around $400 billion per year. That's approximately 17% of the $2.4 trillion in current federal tax receipts. In other words, if the government were to focus on paying down just the interest costs of the debt, that would already be about a fifth of the actual budget. And that's assuming a balanced budget, of course, which the US has not had for a very long time. But the added wrinkle here is the fact that those interest costs are not necessarily fixed. It's not as though we're dealing with a long-term fixed rate mortgage where the payment's going to remain the same no matter what happens to the underlying interest rates of the economy. Now, a large portion of the national debt is longer term debt that isn't going to fluctuate much in interest rate, but a large portion of it is also in short-term treasuries, which might be as little as a year or two or even less. And in those cases, the government constantly has to re-roll these short-term treasuries into new ones, so it's very interest rate sensitive. So if interest rates go up, the rate on these short-term treasuries would also go up, meaning the interest costs would also rise. And because of this, it's estimated that for every 1% increase in the interest rates, that would cause something like an extra $200 billion in annual interest costs on the current national debt, which would mean about another 10% of current federal tax receipts. Point is that if the debt grows large enough, or if interest rates rise to a certain level, that would mean that the federal government simply could not tax its way out of the problem. So we'd have to look for some other solutions. Now, one solution to the national debt that's become more and more relevant, especially in the last few years, is actually printing money to pay for the debt. And this is definitely a solution, but it's not as though it's without huge cost. The general premise is that the Federal Reserve, which is the US central bank, they have the power to print currency to buy federal treasuries, which means that the US government can take on a bunch of debt, sell that debt to the Federal Reserve, which prints new money to buy that debt, and the government has those newly printed dollars to throw into the economy, and inflation thus eats away at the value of that debt, and the government never really runs out of money. But it's not as though this is some get-out-of-jail-free card for the debt problem, because inflation is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can help people like debtors, or the government, which has a bunch of debt, in that the value of the currency that you're using to pay back the debt is now worth less. That's because there are more dollars swimming around despite having the same amount of stuff. But the other side of this sword is the fact that now the cost of everything goes up, because the dollars that you're using to buy everyday items are worth less than before. Meanwhile, people who might have saved money are punished because now their dollars that they saved are worth less than before, and they can get them less stuff than they might have when they initially saved those dollars. Because that's really what a currency is worth. How much stuff can a particular currency unit, like a dollar, what can it get you? So when you look at it that way, really inflation is just another type of tax. It's really a tax on savings. So the government can continue to spend, but it's effectively paying for that spending by eliminating the value of the actual currency. So the debt gets paid down, but meanwhile, purchasing power has been destroyed for many people. We have seen hyperinflationary episodes throughout history. I'm not saying this will happen in the US, but depending on how bad the debt problem gets, it certainly could happen. But not to worry, inflation is not the only solution to the national debt. Another solution to the national debt is to simply default on the debt. And of course, the consequences of doing something like this are also massive. This is where the government simply surrenders to its debt obligations, saying, hey, we can't pay these off, and declares bankruptcy or something like that. Let's think of some of those ramifications. For one, anyone who holds US treasuries is effectively screwed. They don't get anything back. They're simply told to go away. But this also might hurt other countries that hold US debt that might have been expecting to actually get paid back at some point. And in general, this would cause a massive loss in trust. People would no longer trust the US government to actually make good on its obligations because, well, it just defaulted on a bunch of them. I should clarify that an inflationary solution to the debt crisis might actually lead to the same result, where people no longer trust the US government to pay them back with dollars that are worth anything because they're simply printing new money to actually pay for things. But sticking with this proper default example where the government doesn't even print worthless dollars to pay back the national debt, in this case, there'd be massive instability for anyone using US dollars, which is pretty much the whole world. However, this solution, for whatever it's worth, doesn't really seem all that likely because of how politically difficult it would be to actually institute. Who wants to be the person that says, hey, we actually are not going to pay back this debt, too bad, and they're just going to make everyone really angry? It seems like it'd be a lot easier politically to continue to spend money and print money to actually pay back the debt, rather than actually saying, no, we're not going to pay back this debt at all. And if for anything, it'd be because you'd at least have the facade of making good on those obligations. But in any event, it's a pretty brutal solution. Especially if the debt continues to grow, especially at the rate it's been growing, the US government is in a very difficult situation that is going to be very difficult to get out of. Ultimately, the money has been spent, so the US government's going to have to find a way to get some more money to pay back this debt. It might do that through taxes, it might do that by printing money, as it really has been pretty aggressively over the last couple of years especially, and it could always default on its obligations at some point. And I'm not saying any of these full-on solutions will happen anytime soon. There's a pretty good chance that the government will just continue to mount this debt higher and higher before it actually does anything to really address the problem. But the fact of the matter is, this needs to be addressed eventually. It's not as though it's a problem that's just going to disappear on its own. And the more that the government delays in actually dealing with this problem, the bigger the eventual meltdown will be. Because again, this can't go on forever. It's really an issue that I think is dramatically overlooked because no one really wants to cut government spending, no one wants to raise taxes, and when you get deficits year after year after year, decade after decade, you get into these sorts of problems that then become very difficult to get out of. And good luck running a political campaign based on austerity for any significant length of time. Just take a look at Greece for a recent example. But anyways, I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, please like it since that would help the channel out a lot. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't already because I put out new videos every single week as they have to do with personal finance and investing. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to subscribe. But until next time, take care.